Memorial Day weekend 2010. As you know, Memorial Day began as Decoration Day. It began to remember the Union soldiers who had died, and the South refused to participate. By the late 1890s, Memorial Day became a more common term, although there are many of us who remember the old-timers who continued to call it Decoration Day. When the Civil War news hit Deer Isle, which they understood and called, even years after the war, the Rebellion of the South, it was a shock and an outrage. Immediately, people responded to the call for volunteers, and there was a firm belief on this island that the Civil War would only last 3 months, and they would all be home. I'm indebted to Vernon Hutchinson in his history of Deer Isle in the Civil War for that information. By the time Dr. George B. Noyes was dying in 1926, his 90th year at the Opera House, yet unfinished, speaking to the people who were there, all native-born Civil War veterans, which means islanders born here, were already dead. He was the last voice from the Civil War era of anyone who lived on this island. And the scene that I read to you from his book this morning was his last call to remembrance. During the days following the Civil War, Dr. Noyes would always lead the parade, and Civil War veterans would march together at the head of the parade here on Deer Isle to commemorate and to remember the dead. In the last chapter from which I read some excerpts this morning, the Civil War memorabilia, as well as the memory of the Civil War, was a distant past. Lufkin's Canteen, a man who lost his finger shot off during the war. His father was the Captain Lufkin, who kept a diary at the Historical Society, the manuscript. This man's canteen was being beaten as a toy and destroyed. Sam Holden's uniform rotting in an attic. Sam Holden came back to this island as a disabled Civil War veteran, and they gave him the responsibility of keeping the lighthouse at Marks Island. The losses during the Civil War from this island were enormous. What began as what they thought would be three months went into year after year, to the point at the end of the war they were drafting, and the town was borrowing money to give bonuses to people to help support their families. What strikes me as sad about Vernon Hutchinson's book in that last chapter was the forgetting, was the lack of remembering. 90 years of age, he's the last one who had seen the war. But there was a hope on this island at the end of the Civil War that this would be a war to end all wars. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Then came World War I, and then II, and Korean conflict, in some historical consciousness, is just a passing memory. And then there was Vietnam, and the list goes on to Iraq and Afghanistan. And even to this day, we have citizens, young people, men and women from this island serving in the armed forces. The sadness of that story is that people were forgetting. What does it mean to forget? We're conscious of it on a personal level. Some of us have family who are struggling with Alzheimer's. Some of us have struggled with our own memories. Teaching special education to teachers, one of the words I've learned to give and people appreciate is the word dysnomia. It sounds like a horrible disease, but you all know what it is. Dysnomia is the tip of the tongue process that we have. We know what we want to say, but it's just not quite there. That's fairly common. You don't have Alzheimer's if you have dysnomia. You're just having a moment of lapse, tip of the tongue, can't quite get it. I find that encouraging. Where you recognize faces, you say, God, what is their name? Where are you, God? Just slip a name to me. But our consciousness in 2010 is about the serious concerns of physical memory loss. But what Memorial Day, Decoration Day brings back is an awareness that there is much social history that we need to remember. And we need to remember the price that people paid in the service of our country. And so when we decorate the graves and we have the service and the veterans from the Rodney Stinson American Legion gather tomorrow in Deer Isle proper, it will be an act of community memory. Because remembering is important. Robert Beller's quote at the top of your bulletin, an eminent sociologist at the University of California at Berkeley. I had him in one of the courses that I took. He came and spoke. I really liked him. And he talks about communities of memory can turn to communities of hope. It has been said, and you know this quote, I know you know it, to not know history is to repeat it. And one of the alarms that I have as an educator is that we have a culture that does not know our own history, not really know it. I'm not talking about a collection of dates and can we recollect every date of every battle, but I'm talking about our story. For in the word history is the word story. The problem of literacy, both in our literature and in our history and even in the Bible, is a challenge in 2010.